In 2012, I went to Italy again in one of my yearly museum tours. And the interesting thing about Venice really is the Doge Museum. Beautiful museum in the sense that they might not have the biggest collection that you see. However, you'll see pieces, you'll see swords in their collection that you won't see anywhere else, which is something really interesting. Same thing as in Spain. But going back to this, one incredible sword, and actually I went down to Venice specifically to see that one sword, is what we reproduced and called the Doge sword. That sword is very different from anything else that you've ever seen in the medieval sword, European medieval sword classification or arsenal. The design is very different, completely different from anything else that's been made, which makes it one of the interesting pieces of history because it breaks that pattern. It goes away, it deviates from the usual pattern that blacksmiths had at that time period, and which is what makes it really an interesting piece, not only for collectors but also for curators and for people who study the sword. And by study the sword, I don't just mean how to use a sword and all the postures and the movements, I mean people who actually study the history of it and try to look at the parts and determine the ethnographical background of the piece, trying to understand, okay, well, this looks like this, then it must be from this region, that century, and therefore it's that classification. And the Doge sword really stands apart from many, many, many of the swords that we see in the European sword arsenal, which is one of the really interesting things in the Venice Museum, the Doge Museum, which is one reason why when people ask me, which museum should I visit, which museum should I visit, there are lots of really interesting museums all over the world. Some of them are huge. Royal Armories is humongous. Probably has the biggest collection I've ever seen. However, in terms of little differences, little special swords that are very different, you have the Doge Museum, you have the Royal Armory of Madrid, you have the Wallace Collection, which really have these unique pieces. And coming back from the trip, having always seen it in catalogs and not having seen it and as a first contact, first-hand experience, having seen it when I came back, I knew that definitely I wanted to make the sword and give it kind of the dark sword interpretation of it, while of course always respecting certain elements of it. It's a beautiful piece. The weight distribution is a little different from any other European sword as well, because it wasn't one of those swords that was purely made for battle. It was one of those swords that the person would carry around as a status symbol. So you knew who he was just by looking at the sword. So the point of balance on this type of sword is more towards the tip, like kind of 3/4 area of the blade, 3/4 up of the blade. That's where you kind of find the point of balance on this sword, which kind of gives it a very interesting feel when you swing it. Very powerful blows, slightly heavy, but very powerful. Pretty much cut through anything. But again, what I find most important about this piece really is the design. Again, very interesting, very different from anything else, and that really is the key element in this piece.